The new monster manual is in, and this completes the trilogy of core books for D&D 5.5. Now, someone asked me a couple weeks ago if I was going to do a review, and I said, nah, probably not. But then I got it, and I found there's actually a lot to talk about here. There are some really big differences here, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about what sorts of DMs win and what sorts of DMs might feel like they're losing a little bit here. Let's check it out. My name is Nate, and you are watching WASD20. If you love tabletop role-playing games as much as I do, I would love to have you subscribe for more videos like this, including videos on games that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. But in this video, the new monster manual. First off, this cover. I absolutely love it. Now, I gotta say, I was not planning to get the special edition cover. I went to the store fully intending to get the normal book because honestly, I just like the matching spines on my bookshelf. I know, it's kind of weird, but this book doesn't match. However, when I got to the store and I saw it, I had to have it. So we've got the Mind Flayer on the cover. It's got that nice metallic sheen that we've come to love. And yeah, it's just absolutely gorgeous, and I had to have it. It's my favorite special edition cover of any of the books. But getting beyond the cover, this monster manual is the largest monster manual Dungeons & Dragons has ever made in terms of page count, and it has the most monsters of any of them with over 500. I think there are something like over 80 new monsters in this book. Some of the highlights I'm hearing a lot about are the Blob of Annihilation and the Colossus. These are some of the bigger, kind of more unique creatures in the book, but there are also tons of new variants on existing monsters, and so it's kind of this line of what actually constitutes a new monster. Personally, I love having more variants. In the 2014 Monster Manual, we had 2 Goblin stat blocks, one for Goblin and one for Goblin Boss. In this one, we now have 4 Goblin stat blocks, the Goblin Minion, Goblin Warrior, Goblin Boss, and Goblin Hexer. That same thing is true for countless other monsters in the book, and it just gives Dungeon Masters more flexibility. Like, I remember when I wanted to run a vampire in a low-level Dungeons & Dragons game. I was pretty new to the hobby, and I looked at the vampire and I thought, whoa, no way. The only other option I had was Vampire Spawn, which wasn't quite doing it for me either. So there were 2 vampires in the 2014 book, and now we have Vampire Familiar, Vampire Spawn, Vampire Nightbringer, Vampire, and Vampire Umbral Lord, so we get 5 vampire variations. If you like owlbears as much as I do, you'll be very pleased to know there is now a primeval owlbear, which takes the challenge rating from a 3 on the original owlbear to a 7. It's bigger, and apparently it can kind of fly? Fly speed of 5 feet, so not well. So anyway, lots more variants, gives more tools in the toolkit for a Dungeon Master, and it's a very good thing. Another positive thing is that the monsters are organized in a more alphabetical manner than they were in the 2014 book. I often got confused when looking at the 2014 book. When I was flipping through the beginning of the book, there seemed to be no alphabetical sense at all because devils, demons, and dragons were all near the beginning of the book, and totally unorganized. So I'm flipping through here and I see Quasit, and I think I'm in the Q section, but I'm like at the beginning of the book, and you realize then, oh, I'm in the demon section of the book. Anyway, once you learned it, it wasn't bad, and I know that some DMs who have learned that system will probably be frustrated with the new monster manual. There are advantages to having all the demons together, all the dragons together. We'll talk about that when we get to the not so good parts of the book. But overall, I do view this as a change that is much more beginner friendly, and honestly, even as a veteran, I still often got confused. Now, it's not complete. There are certain monsters that are still grouped together, like the slods, for example. There are several different color slods. Blue slod is not under B, whereas blue dragon is under B and red dragon is under R. Hags were one that were kind of surprising to me. I thought those would be grouped together. Instead, green hag is under G, night hag is under N, etc. But yeah, overall, I find flipping through the new monster manual, I get less confused by the alphabetical nature. Now, one category of changes here in this book is I think that it is made to be more usable at the table. The font size is slightly larger than the 2014 book, for example. So less squinting and putting your nose right up to the book to read it. Another thing that will really help at the table is having stat blocks that have fewer complete sentences and more just colons and headings and things like that, that will just make it easier to read at a glance. For example, if we look at the 2014 book, we can read the Medusa stat block, and see this huge blocks of tiny text. We don't need to read, when a creature that can see the Medusa's eyes starts its turn within 30 feet of the Medusa can force it to make a DC 14 Constitution saving throw if the Medusa isn't incapacitated and can see the creature. If the saving throw fails by 5 or more, the creature is instantly petrified. Rather, in the new one, we just see Petrifying Gaze. Constitution saving throw, DC 13, each creature in a 30-foot cone. And it goes on from there, and there is a bit to read, but it's way less than in the 2014 book, and it's just way easier to read at a glance. Faster prep, and easier to use at the table. In addition, across the board, any of the creatures that could cast spells, the list of spells has been reduced dramatically, and overall I think that's a good thing because sometimes they could just get overwhelming. We didn't need all of these spells for a lich, and we don't need to be dealing with spell slots. Instead, we get a much shorter list of spells. These ones can be cast at will, these ones 2 per day each, and these ones 1 per day each. It's way more manageable, easier to make decisions at the table about which spell the creature will cast, and easier in the prep phase. Speaking of being more usable at the table, one thing you might want for your D&D game is some good miniatures to represent all the awesome monsters in this book. Now, Geek Tank Games has these awesome GTG minis that are so great. They're bright, colorful, vibrant, super durable 2D miniatures that you just slot into these little plastic bases. You get a really great selection of a lot of the classic D&D monsters you would expect. Things like owlbear, ogre, trolls, goblins, gnolls, Otyughs, just so many great creatures here, and they have tons of course for your player characters as well. So definitely go check them out, and when you purchase these miniatures, which are one of the best values out there, you can also get an additional discount if you use my code WASD20Nate. Using that code or the link down in the video description gets you that discount as well as giving the channel a small commission, so it's a really great way that you can support the channel, and I want to thank GTG for partnering with me to bring you these videos. In addition to being more usable at the table, I think this book will speed combat up in several ways. First, there are overall fewer saving throws that player characters will have to make after an attack from a monster hits. Instead, if the attack hits, something will automatically happen. Sticking with the Lich, Paralyzing Touch now says that when it hits, the creature will have the paralyzed condition until the start of the Lich's next turn. Another example is the Wolf, which says that when it hits with its bite attack, if the target is a medium or smaller creature, it has the prone condition. No more strength saving throw to avoid being knocked prone. Now, I can see some people not liking that, but overall, I think we don't need so many dice rolls. This will speed combat up, and it will make combat slightly more deadly, which I think is something that needed to happen in D&D. Another way that this book is going to speed up combat is by having less variety in the sorts of attacks creatures can do. Now, you can still add your own variety and flavor, but for example, there were many creatures in 2014 that had a bite and claw attack, and those attacks have been simplified into just one called Rend. Now, I do wish they explained that a little better, and for each creature maybe say, a rend attack for this creature could be a bite or melee, but I don't think we needed different die rolls, like a D8 for the bite, but a D6 for the claw attack on this creature. It's like, no, let's just simplify it. That level of nuance is just not important. But yeah, I do wish there was a little bit more description of what the rend attack for each creature could be, because rend is not a word I use in my normal vocabulary, and when I looked it up, it just means to tear. So let's talk about what is this creature actually doing. The dragon now makes its rend attack is not as cool as the dragon's gonna come try to bite you, or it's going to slash at you with its talons. But I'm supposed to be sticking to the positive here. We're gonna get to the negative in a minute. The art. The art is way better in this book. It's some of the best art I've seen in a D&D book, and one of the things I love about it is that we actually get scenes with these monsters. We can see scale against player characters, and we can see the sorts of attacks they might do, rather than these sort of portraits that we got in the 2014 book. So for example, we see these hill giants here, just tearing apart this village, one of them holding up a cow. We get a sense of the huge scale of these creatures. Or this manticore chasing a person on a flying rug. Like, this is much better than just seeing a manticore standing up alone on a page. Now, as I already mentioned, the new Monster Manual does provide more deadly challenges for player characters. And I think that's fully appropriate because people often complained that it was too easy to mow through a lot of monsters in 5th edition. And now in the new Player's Handbook, player characters, you could argue, are definitely more powerful with things like weapon mastery, So as the player characters become more powerful, it's only appropriate that the monsters become more challenging as well. Now, I didn't notice any of the challenge ratings changing for monsters, but you do notice that some of them have a higher armor class. Maybe the hit points have been adjusted, but I would say there's a general trend toward actually having slightly lower armor class for a lot of the creatures and more hit points, which I think is cool because it's more fun to hit, and combat can really get boring when it's miss, miss, miss. Oh, you missed too? Let the players feel like they're doing something, even if the monster itself has not become any easier. Additionally, pretty much across the board, monsters do have higher initiative bonuses. In 2014, we would just take the Dex modifier. Now they have a separate initiative bonus that, especially for higher level monsters, is going to be way higher. This unicorn, for example, has a Dex modifier of +2, but its initiative bonus is +8. So that is going to make combat more deadly. Monsters are going to get into combat sooner and be able to do their thing. All right, so far we've talked about a lot of the positive changes here, but let's talk about some of the negative. As I did mention, the more alphabetical nature of this book is still inconsistent and confusing. Like, I really don't understand why they separated hags. I think what it led them to do is to actually change the lore for hags and give them less in common. So that's, I guess, the general rule of thumb, is that the lore has been changed for some creatures to give them less in common, justifying separating them, and other creatures like the Slod or Mephits have been deemed to have enough in common that it is justified for them to be together alphabetically. Dust Mephit, Ice Mephit, they're not found under D or I, they're found under M for Mephit. So who gets left behind in that process is, in my opinion, dungeon masters who like to use this as kind of a campaign prep guide, where they're actually really digging into the lore on the demons or devils, if that's kind of a central part of their campaign. And having those all together is actually really useful because you can get a sense of that sort of creature, and you have less flipping around when you know you want to find a devil for a game session, but you're just trying to decide which one is appropriate. Now you're going to be flipping around through this book a lot in order to do that. If you have D&D Beyond, you'll have a little less flipping around because you can look at that list of creatures by type, and they are hyperlinked so you can see the stat blocks really quickly. But if you have the physical book, you're going to be looking at this list here on page 381 for devils, for example, and you'll see them all here, but you don't even get the page number. It actually just names them and leaves them to you to find alphabetically. So overall, I do think that the change to a more alphabetical system was probably for the best, but it's still just a bit confusing. In addition, across the board in the 2024 book, there is less lore for pretty much every single creature. So again, those DMs who like to use this as a guide for them to actually prep campaigns, picking the perfect villain for their campaign, the perfect monsters for a mini arc in their campaign, you get less lore, and that gives you less fodder for good stories, essentially. Fortunately, you can still find a lot on the internet, but it would be nice to have a little more lore here. I understand that is a sacrifice that was made so that they could make the font a little bit bigger. It is more readable. I think that's a very positive thing. And include more monsters, more variations, and not have to increase the price to $60 or $70 because the page count was so high. Another big thing that's been getting a lot of buzz is the lack of certain monsters in the monster manual. Orcs being one of the main ones. Orcs are no longer a monster, they are a playable race. So let's talk about this. There is no orc stat block, there is no drow stat block, there is no duergar stat block. Appendix B does have a stat block conversion table, and what we see here is that for drow, for example, they are recommending you use the priest acolyte stat block. For drow mage, the bandit deceiver stat block. For duergar, spy. For orc, use the tough stat block. And those stat blocks all come from this long list of kind of NPC-like creatures on this humanoids list. You can see all of them right here on page 380. And they're all scattered throughout the book in alphabetical order. Now, I honestly don't think it's a big deal, and as a DM, I'm very comfortable modifying stat blocks to fit a certain creature that I know something about. But for a lot of DMs, I know they're really feeling the loss of really specific stat blocks that include some lore about the culture and societies of these various races. So orcs have changed pretty drastically. If you read the description in the player's handbook, it is nothing like the traditional orcs of Dungeons and Dragons. They're now a completely playable race, therefore we shouldn't expect them to be in the monster manual. Never mind that drow were a playable race as well back in 2014, and they were in the monster manual. But yeah, the point is, orcs have changed. They're no longer monsters, they're no longer mostly evil. Now, as someone who has some nostalgia for more traditional D&D orcs, as well as the orcs in Lord of the Rings, or even the orcs in Warcraft 1, Orcs and Humans, or Warcraft 2, Tides of Darkness, I've played so much of those games, love them. It's a bit sad to see orcs not in the monster manual. The removal of duergar is an interesting one because they are not mentioned in the player's handbook either. So they're not in the player's handbook, they're not in the monster manual, they've essentially been erased. Deep gnomes share that fate as well, they're not described in the player's handbook or the monster manual. Wizards of the Coast has clearly taken the approach of removing creatures that are simply the twisted and slightly evil versions of playable races. And that's not entirely surprising. They've been moving towards this for a while, and in my opinion, it was problematic, for example, that in earlier editions, there were elves, which were often noble, good, and happened to be fair-skinned, and then there were the underground version of elves that were evil. Oh, and by the way, they had dark skin. Now, they've shied away from that in recent years, I think appropriately, and now drow are often depicted with gray skin, purple skin, or bluish skin that's not really much darker than other elves. And for that matter, traditional high elves or wood elves are often depicted with different colors of skin. So I know a lot of people would say people are taking this too seriously, it's just fantasy, but I think the "it's just fantasy" defense only goes so far. And this is coming from someone who read the entire Dark Elf trilogy by R.A. Salvatore and absolutely loved it. The drow culture with its matriarchal houses vying for power in the Underdark was fascinating to me as a teenager, and I still love these books. Now our description of drow is limited to, drow typically dwell in the Underdark and have been shaped by it. Some drow individuals and societies avoid the Underdark altogether, yet carry its magic. Duergar were likewise a really cool race, and yes, we can substitute in one of these other stat blocks, but you're missing out on so much culture and so many cool, unique abilities. Like, Duergar have the ability to enlarge themselves and essentially become an 8 to 10 foot dwarf. How cool is that? I'm sorry to report that the spy stat block does not have an enlarge ability. So anyway, there are countless other videos on this specific topic, but I do think Wizards of the Coast is clearly taking a tactic of dodging real-world issues in their game completely by just changing the lore without commentary and leaving certain things out. And from a corporate perspective, I honestly think that's probably the right approach, even if we don't love it. All this to say, I do wish orcs were here, but for me, it's not a huge deal. I can still use the old 2014 orc stat block if I want to, and I think there were even more in Volo's guide, and as long as I still have the classic goblins, bugbears, skeletons, and kobolds, I'll have enough fodder for low-level adventures. And honestly, the tough stat block for orcs is gonna work just fine. So overall, I gotta say, I really like this new monster manual. Again, I was not planning to do a video on this, but I got it, and I just thought, man, there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about here. A lot of improvements, honestly. And there are some things that I know some of us don't like quite as much. So that's my take on the new monster manual. I would love to hear yours as well. Let me know down in the comments. And by the way, if you're looking for more videos on D&D 5.5, I do have a video on character creation with the new rules, which is pretty different than the 2014 rules. And if you're wanting to get an overview of the changes in the 2024 Player's Handbook, I've got a video for that as well. All right, that's all for this one. Take care, everybody. You'll see me again very soon.